saying, this is the Egyptian government, this is like any other government, these are their good points, these are their bad points.
Like we
this
do
is
with
what we
Saudi.
like anyone else. It becomes an issue of domestic partisan American politics. I think it reached a China in the 2016 election, and that spin or that environment continues to this day. So people see Egypt, when they see Egypt, they're not thinking of Egypt, they're thinking of Trump, or they're thinking of, whatever, and seeing it within the context of something else which is happening where they have issues, good issues or bad issues or indifferent. This is, I think, one of the reasons for that demonization of Egypt, which I don't think is helpful.
Thank you very much. Do we have a microphone? Or? Okay, great. So please, we'd like to ask a question.
So if I'm understanding correctly, what you're suggesting is that we can provide support to initiatives going on inside Egypt to challenge the Islamist narrative, which I think is a brilliant idea. Let me ask another idea. So, we're obviously at an age with the new administration that we're exploring new options. And I think we're also having to recognize that the tactics we've been using against ISIS, let's say, really have done nothing to tarnish the brand. So another idea that I've heard floated, we didn't do it before, I'm wondering if you think this is something that makes sense. What about bringing conversations that we have in our own country and engaging Egyptians with those? So for example, ideas about separation of church and state, or First Amendment freedoms, or those are the obvious ones. Do you think there's any place for that? Do you think there's any value in that? Or are the two things just too far removed?
Any of you. Any of the four.
I mean, I'm not an expert in that, but I don't know what will happen. But what I can say is that Egypt has its own form of democracy and its own form of secularism. And in the Muslim world, having countries being explicitly stated as Islam is the religion of the state, Arabic is the language of the nation is very important. And actually, there's a section in the report that talks about a little bit of the history of that, going back to Egypt's first constitution, I believe it was 1924. But that's their way of expressing. I mean, the whole codification process of the whole Arab world, not just Egypt, it's all based on codifying Islamic law. The codes, the national codes of Egypt are Sharia laws, but written in a way that's compatible with modern legal norms and stuff like that. That's the way that the Muslim world, specifically the Arab world, has chosen to express democracy, republicanism, secularism and things like that. I think if we go with our notion of an American democracy and secularism, it's not going to make sense. And I think this is part of the problem in the past, where we're just trying to force, well, we don't do religion, you have to be secular the way we're secular, you have to be democratic the way we're democratic. That's not very democratic. For us to tell...
I didn't mean in the sense of imposing, I just actually meant intellectual conversation. Like, I feel like, especially kind of once we lost USIA, we lost the resources to send our intellectuals and our academics abroad. I feel like these kind of intellectual conversations don't happen. I didn't mean it at all, like an imposition of American democracy, just a way to have a conversation.
No, I think it's very important actually, because one of the main arguments of organizations like ISIS is that these governments, I mean this is what Qutb says, that these governments are not Islamic at all, and therefore not legitimate, and therefore I have the right, individual obligation, as the Faraj said, the Farid al-Ghaiba, the absent obligation. I have an individual obligation to raise arms against the state and usurp power. So this conversation will help instigate, well, actually no, Egypt is, from the Sharia point of view, an Islamic state. Why? Because 1, 2, 3, 4. So actually it does have its utility.
To me, it's an interesting point because I've been involved in speakers programs, the U.S. State Department speakers programs, for almost 20 years. So I've seen a number of iterations of them over the years, and it seems like losing USIA was a real tragedy. I think sharing our culture and our tradition so that they could take from them what was helpful and adapt them and do with them what they please is lost to. And I worry about the slippery slope into why don't you like us? So I just don't want it to because that's what ends up happening is they send us on these programs to convince Muslims to like us, and I hated those programs. going over there and having to do that was very painful because I don't see how that helps them, because right now we have this hemorrhaging, we have this serious ideological problem in Islam, and I don't know if that's the best way to help them solve that problem. It is an important effort, but it just needs to be, I guess, properly used for its proper purposes.
If I could make a point on that, I mean, this, we're talking about something that I and others did for many years in state or in USIA. I think the problem is not so much bringing a speaker or not bringing a speaker. I think the problem is that this may seem unfair and harsh, but I think it's true, is that the cadre of people in the Foreign Service that do this, who are hardworking, good people, are not accustomed to the concept of, to be blunt, ideological war, to the concept of ideological engagement, of intellectual engagement, so that they see speakers like what you're referring to, like you, Hadia, is something that I don't know anything about this, I need an Islam speaker. What do you have, Washington? Send me an Islam speaker and I plug this person in. There's little investment that goes on the personal level before and after the speaker comes. I remember in Jordan, years after I left Jordan, a meeting with the president of the main university in Ma'had, Jordan, which is a hotbed of jihadism. And I said, how's it going? How's the embassy treating? This is many years after I served in Jordan. And he said, fine. He said, they sent some Imam al-Hindi. You know, he was here for 2 days. It's very nice. He said, the problem is the jihadists and the Islamists are here every day. You Americans come, you bring this guy in for one day, and you think you solved that problem. We need to go deeper in these things.
Yeah, please, Julia. Oh, Eric, sorry.
Yeah, first of all, I want to commend the report. I had a chance to take a look at it. It's very good. It has real original field work, and I just think you deserve.
Please you, Eric.
Well, then I'm pleased. Then case closed. So, but my question is, the idea of engaging Al-Azhar, engaging, the folks there. The United States has a real difficulty engaging in Egypt because, frankly, the current Egyptian government explains the chaos of the previous 6.5 years in part due to what it calls fourth generation warfare, in which foreign entities stoked organizations within the country, and they're very skeptical, to put it mildly, if not outwardly hostile, to the type of engagement that you recommend. I mean, Ambassador Fernandez noted the narrative that one hears on Egyptian television all the time about foreign plots to destabilize the country when it comes to sending childhood literacy programs. Those have been blocked. So how could we expect that they will be open to the type of engagement with religious scholars and teachers that you recommend when they won't even allow childhood literacy, let alone election monitors, let alone all the other types of NGO-type programs? Because there's just a skepticism of engagement with anyone in Egypt apart from the state.
So I think that's what the word diplomacy means. I think you have to ask diplomatically. I know that when President Sisi was here in March, half of what he said to the Egyptian community, and I was in attendance, was about the concern that the government has with fighting extremism. And so there's an opportunity there. Al-Azhar as an institution is also, very much wanting to engage, is engaging in this issue. So I think that it's how we ask. When we went, we found out that the English Language Institute and the campus, the American English Language Institute and the campus of Al-Azhar was closed because, somebody didn't pay like the electric bill or something. So the Americans, rent or something like that. So that's not very diplomatic, but the British, this English language thing was up and running. So I think, yes, you're right. But the Egyptian government doesn't, will see things like monitoring of elections and why are you closing all these NGOs as being intrusive. But if we say, I'm assuming, if we say, oh, Egyptian government, we see that you have this big thing called Azhar and you're doing all these great things, we'd like to help them doing what they're doing, I think that they would be receptive. I mean, they were receptive when we went. So So, and we were very open about what we were doing. So I think it's how we asked. But if we're like, pointing the finger, Ahmed to Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib, and talking to him like this, he's just gonna zone out, or the president or something like that. So I think it's really how we ask. As you can see, I'm not very diplomatic, so I'm not the person who asks.
That's why I like it.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Juliana.
It's primarily a question for Ambassador Fernandez, although addressing Hedia's point about how you didn't like having to go over there and say, like us. Yeah, but isn't it really a cultural problem of the United States that's very deep when you consider how we define soft power, the power of attraction? I don't mean we, but Joseph Nye and everybody seems to have adopted that concept. So, specific question, Alvora, other programs under your command.
Yes.
What are some of the things you're doing right? What can be done better? What do you think the new BBG can do with the new structure and let's hope very soon a very fine head? What will that do, and how can we resist our own, and I'll add just one more problem that we have, and it has to do with the fact that teaching about religion in this country is very difficult. In a university and so forth, the concept of engaging ideologically is problematic in part because we have taken this church-state division to absurd degrees, so that we in many ways are preventing ourselves from learning more about religion in an objective fashion. Sorry, longer question.
Well, I would just say I think you have two questions there. First on, I'll answer two of them. On the question of ideology, we have a problem in America in that the dominant. Some of you may disagree with this and may be offended, but too bad. The dominant ideology in the United States is a type of liberalism, which is an ideology which it's people who hold it don't believe it's an ideology, right? And so they look at the other, right, and people who are traditionalists, or religious traditionalists, or conservatives as some kind of exotic creature, like there's something wrong with them. Well, we don't understand that. Just the way they would not understand, say, a practicing Catholic, they would not understand the way what motivates a Muslim, right? Surely it must be because they don't have a job, or because America is evil, or because the Jews are coming to get you. It must be about that. It can't be because it's a struggle about ideology with Islam, about these questions of leadership, of authority, of governance. Al-Azhar is involved in these things, right? So there's a kind of certain naivete that exists in the West. I joke that the culture and the language and the anthropology that is best understood by our elites is the culture of the tribe that lives between Arlington, Virginia, and the island of Manhattan. That's what our elite believes in and knows about. That's what they know about. Not the people of Anbar province or Upper Egypt or stuff like that. So there's a problem with our elites when it comes to religion, when it comes to belief, or when it comes to ideology. Even though our elites are deeply ideological, they don't think they are. Everyone else is, but not them. That's one problem. And Al-Hura, I've been there 6 weeks, so I'll leave BBG to talk about themselves. I can talk to you about my vision about Al-Hura. I've said this publicly, and that is that we need to be a station that the region is saturated when it comes to broadcast media. There are hundreds of stations, and they're all very similar to each other. There are two principal types of media in the region. Sultawi, the regime media of different sorts, the media that echoes the discourse of regimes, and after them, the Islamists. That's 98, 99% of the media in the region. So if Al-Hurra and Sawa and the other properties we have are going to have any chance of carving out an identity, you have to cultivate a very different identity. So what I am working to do, and I'm making progress, sometimes it seems like very little progress, but I'm working on it, is that this needs to be a network that is much more deeply American in a kind of communicating information about the United States, and, to be blunt, self-consciously, aggressively, and unabashedly liberal. I don't mean liberal like America liberal, or a liberal versus conservative in America. I mean that it stands up for these universal liberal values that we believe. It's not about talking about saying that the government should be democratic or not. That's a simplistic thing. You're absolutely right. It's about talking about concepts of pluralism, concepts of freedom of expression, concepts of tolerance, for liberal voices, for secular voices, for heterodox voices in the region. We're beginning to do that in many different ways. Would be a whole session on what we're doing. But you have to fight. I mean, it does go back to Katie's question, that of others. It is part of fighting an ideological battle. And the Islamists and the jihadists have had decades and have had carte blanche for many years to shift the paradigm in a certain direction. That's why you look at Egyptian movies of the 1940s, and you look at Egyptian movies of today, or you see these pictures of graduates of Baghdad University Medical School in 1970, and you look at graduates of Baghdad Medical School today, and you see the difference is that the ground has shifted in a certain direction. People did that, they worked hard to do it. So we, at MBN, and others in the foreign policy apparatus, need to work hard. One of the problems there is that government tends to think in the short term, whereas our adversaries, these subvertives, both Islamists and jihadists, like communists, like Nazis, like fascists, they think in the long term. For them, it's an ideological struggle. It's something they believe in. Whereas for us, it's like, I'm in Egypt for 2 years, I have to look at my next assignment, I want to go to Paris next. We're not invested the way a fanatic is invested.
Can I ask something? I want to bring a comment and ask if you're bringing it back then to Katie's point. So are we saying that, because we don't want this going back to the whole, we're going to send Britney Spears to the Middle East. Like, you know how when we talk about American liberalism, it suddenly goes to the lowest hanging fruit, where it's just kind of like, we're going to make a rock station, and like all these kind of very bizarre solutions.
Yeah.
So you're talking about liberal intellectual thought.
Yes.
Like, so then maybe it's the same point, Katie, that you were saying, is that having that discourse of true scholars that understand liberalism, that understand democracy and societies, to have an exchange with these Middle Eastern Islamic scholars or secular leaders or whatever it may be, so that they mature their perspectives, understand each other, and what have you.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's what
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for your presentation today. I do have a question. This might be Dr. Tarek, but it might be directed at you, but I'd encourage anyone to address this. So I think there's a strong assumption of the power of traditional institutions, traditional circles to be the antidote to jihadism and extremism. It makes a lot of sense, right? Credibility of these institutions, they're long-lasting and they're legitimate and respected. But I'm wondering if someone could talk to the limitations of traditionalism, I mean, broadly, right? I mean, obviously there are different types of traditions, right? From the Sufi tradition, all types of traditions. But if the message is that these institutions and these thinkers and scholars are going to be the ones to counter jihadism, how do we address the limitations that they may have to deal with the 2017 environment, right? So even if we're respecting the tradition, for example, I have 3 children. I have 3 kids, 2 daughters. When I think about raising my Muslim children, I'm not just relying on the traditional institutions. I want my daughters to understand a lot of things, and it goes back to Ambassador Fernandez in terms of pluralism, intellectual freedom, critical thinking, right? How are traditional institutions addressing these issues? Because if we want, and again, maybe I have my American bias, but if we really want to address these issues, how are we going to address those limitations?
I think the word traditional is not the right word to use for Al-Azhar. So if you could summarize the Azhar methodology in 3 points, it would be to understand the divine text, to understand the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. That is where you use quote-unquote traditional tools of interpretation, but then to understand the moment of the time that we live in today, which is the exact opposite of that, and to be able to link this to that. Because from a theological point of view, the sources of the Islamic religion are from the realm of the divine, which is from a theological point of view, the absolute. Our moment now is temporary. So to bring the absolute or the divine into the temporary, that means that it's always going to change. Al-Azhar's job is to keep that, I don't want to say tradition, but to keep that methodology going all the time. So when I was at Al-Azhar, we talked about things like nanotechnology. We talked about the trends of fiat currency. I didn't even know what fiat currency was until I went to Al-Azhar. One of my teachers, he wrote an 800-page dissertation on fiat currency, which is overkill, but he did it anyway. We talked about the trends of pornography, sex education. We tried to start a sex education program that was very, hush-hush. All of these type of things. So the people that I studied with were very, very much aware of where they live and when they live. And they are trying to link this to that. So I think it's the methodology that Al-Azhar represents. Now, are there old ways of thinking Al-Azhar? Absolutely. As you saw from the statistics, it's massive. But there's nobody at Al-Azhar that says the earth is flat. There's nobody at Al-Azhar that says, we didn't land on the moon. There's nobody at Al-Azhar that says, the things that we hear coming out of other places, like the former Mufti of Saudi Arabia, who defended and wrote that the earth is flat, that denied that we landed on the moon in public lectures, and then wrote these things. I mean, you're not going to find that. But you'll find a little bit of social conservatism, sure, but that's much more about being from the Egyptian countryside than it is as a reflection of Al-Azhar as an institution. But the top level of the organization, they're very aware of what's going on. So I think that I guess it's how we define the word traditionalism, or maybe we should find another word, I guess. But it does have limits. Without that, we acknowledge that there are limits to it. But I don't think it's in the methodology. I think that's one of its assets.
And that's a very accurate answer in terms of the theology, but I think you may have also been referencing their institutions, possibly. So, I'll just answer from an institutional perspective, because I have met with communities in I think now 37 countries, both in the Western and Muslim world, and I'm a little concerned that this has been happening for so long, they have lost the capacity to fight back. That we've been saying this, and Mohammed's nodding his head because he has seen the same things I have, and I'm sure a lot of people have, but we keep saying empower the moderates, empower the moderates, empower the moderates, but they've been so unempowered for so long, their institutions are crumbling. So we heard this from the Pakistanis, we heard this from the Afghans, we heard it from some of the Egyptians, but they have the support of the state, which is a little bit different. But their inability to defeat the extremists and the nouveau riche extremists has led to a decay of their institutions. And I am not quite clear how we rebuild that without a massive multi-billion-dollar effort, which I don't see us doing, not even in this administration, to be honest. And I, even in this country, have the same concern you have as raising a child, is that, where am I going to send my kid to mosque? You know what I mean? It's just the inability for the traditionals to fight back, even in this country, means that we don't even control, other than Dr. Tariq's mosque, a little half and half, only when he's there. But other than that, we don't even own institutions in this country. So what do we expect is going to happen in Egypt or Sudan, or not Egypt, but like Africa or Southeast Asia and countries like that? So I'm a little pessimistic about and have a little bit of a bleak outlook on that issue, but it's a huge problem.
Just to tack on to that, I think part of that is this mentality that a lot of these scholars have that it's very old school. They're used to people seeking knowledge from them. They will come to us, we don't need to come to them. So this idea of, getting media communications training to be a talking head, to have this egoistic personality, it's almost anathema to them. But they're now starting to realize, when we had brought the group, a delegation of senior religious scholars here, they had a social media audit. And it was embarrassing because they were opening up their websites for Darul Ifta.
They couldn't find words.
Well, there was a discrepancy of how to spell it. Was it AL, was it UL, was there a dash in there? So they are trying very hard. They have created an enormous amount of content, but it's just simply not at the level that's comparable to groups like ISIS. So, when we talk about building up institutional capacity, it's giving these groups a greater voice, giving them more airtime, connecting them to more policymakers so that they have greater visibility at that international level.
If I could just add one point on that, I think I agree with everything that's said there. Al-Azhar is not immune from a much broader phenomenon which is happening not just in the Middle East, but worldwide. And that is, sociologists call this the democratization of religious authority. Everyone's an expert. Everyone knows better, right? Now in Islam, because of the nature of especially Sunni Islam, this is always a challenge, but it's happening everywhere, right? Everyone feels that I know the Bible better than you, Pope, so-and-so. Everybody has that kind of mentality. It's part of the spirit of the age, it's part of the nature of social media. And you see ISIS, for example, using this. So ISIS will put a guy, some nobody who maybe wasn't even a Muslim until like a week ago, right? And what does he go on? And he tells you the power of his testimony. It's actually like in a Baptist church, right? I was a sinner. Now I'm on the right path. And he does it with such utter conviction and power that has much more social media power than some bearded sheikh with years of learning who is expecting that people are going to come to him. No, that's not the way the world works anymore. The way the world works is there's a kind of flattening of knowledge. So you better be clever, witty, magnetic, whatever, to find a way to reach those audiences. The old ways are not going to work in that sense.
So I just got back last night from Rwanda. I was with the Grand Mufti of Rwanda, spent Eid prayers with him. And I'm going to ask you a question that he presented to me along with being in Zanzibar. He said he had studied in Libya. The deputy studied at Al-Qarawiyyin. Another studied at Abu Nur with the late Sheikh Ahmed Kuftaro. And essentially their question was, how do you inoculate good ideas with Salafis? Because the question that he brought up, and many others, as I was engaging with them, was mainstream Islam in the contemporary context is Salafi Islam. It's not the traditional voices of the past that certainly we all can perhaps agree and have drunk the same Kool-Aid. But how do you inoculate those masses who are conservative, who may justify various actions of Daesh or Al-Qaeda, etc.? And so this is, I think, an interesting question that I would pose to you all as it relates to this report just coming out, because these are real questions they're wrestling with. And some of their students studied at Al-Azhar and have coming back, and certainly have been products of the good education efforts of that. But Al-Azhar is not everywhere. And there's still a number of scholarships that are provided at various universities that individuals then return home, and then what happens?
So are you saying that they're saying basically the mainstream is Salafism now?
Absolutely.
It's to reappropriate
We lost.
the word Salafi. So at Al-Azhar we would always say we are Salaf. We are Salafis. This is what it is. If you look at the Salaf, look at how they lived. There was Suhaib the Roman Bilal the African, Salman the Persian. There were people that drank, there were people that fornicated, there were people that fought, people that cried. If you look at the 100,000 recorded companions when the Prophet died, peace be upon him, less than 5% of them were mujtahids, less than 5% of them were legal experts. So they were a motley crew of people. But we look into them with reverence because of their association with the Prophet, because they were blessed to see him physically and to be with him. So I think it's about reappropriating what that word means. And that's why Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti, Allah have mercy on him, he wrote that book that Salafism is a time period, a historical time period, but not a school of thought. It's not, you can't relive that time period. But if we actually spent half a minute looking at what life was like for them, we would understand that they were diverse, that they were confused, that they were fighting for their lives, that they were struggling to make ends meet, they were being attacked from the north and the south, and so on and so forth. So I think the best way is to reappropriate that. The other thing specifically for sub-Saharan Africa that we have noticed, and this has nothing to do with the report, because you asked, is that I think emphasizing hadith studies. Because the people like ISIS and all of these, they actually don't have a command of the hadith. And that's why historically when Imam Ali told Abu Musa al-Ash'ari to go and debate with the Khawarij, he said, don't argue with them based on the Quran. Because you're going to say a verse, they're going to say a verse, and you can make it mean. But he said, argue with them only on the hadith. Because the hadith is definitive. Because it's human speech specific. If we reappropriate the concept of Salafism, if we reappropriate specifically the subject of hadith studies, they will win this battle over this concept of, because these are, as the ambassador said, they're just slogans, testimonials. This is how I feel, this is what I think. Who cares what you think and what you feel? What did the Salaf, okay, let's talk about real Salafism. How did they live? How did they react? How did they interact? And to take a deep dive into that, I think those are the two things that I think I found to go for. Sorry for the tangent.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to sort of broaden the conversation out because we've talked obviously considerably about ideology. The report touches on the benefits of English language training for at least some Al-Azhar officials, and presumably that ties back to Tarek, your point about the translations that they're doing and the languages that their fatwa are being translated into, a lot of European languages, not just English, and they're now being posted by Dar al-Iftat. And then of course we've touched on, Mahreen, you touched on social media training. But I think Alberto, you came probably the closest to sort of, hitting the big nail on the head. And that is, what do religious leaders know, or in many cases don't know about youth? What do they know about youth psychology? What do they know about engaging youth? And engaging youth is just more than getting on social media, because there's a lot of research out there that shows that even youth that are heavy social media users want and benefit from personal engagement. They want to feel like they're being spoken to directly and on a personal level. That's just one example of what the research tells us. So there's a whole sort of, and other folks have called this what in other religions is called pastoral care, pastoral care approach. And there are some people who have questioned whether there needs to be more of that, particularly as it pertains to youth. But I think there's a whole dimension there. It's not just about, can they tweet more effectively, or are they, more like Amr Khalid or something like that, in their public speaking style. I mean, those are all sort of pieces of it, but I think there's a fundamental kind of sort of youth psychology and understanding, and then what do you do with that knowledge beyond social media, right?
Yeah, so this was the role of the Sufi orders in Egypt. So if you belong to a tariqah, this is where you're going to get the pastoral care. Because in Azhar, it's to produce scholars, it's to produce scholarship. Very little people skills. Maybe even negative people skills. So if you sit with somebody like Sheikh Idris al-Idrisi, for example, in the south, That's his role. You land in Luxor and you tell the security guard, I want to go to Dara. Oh, please make him make dua, supplication for me and my kid is sick. And he has more power in the south than the state does. But these infrastructures are also a little bit fractured and not necessarily accessible for all classes of society. So this is actually, I think Al-Azhar sat with the church because the church excels at pastoral care. I actually think that they could learn from them. How do we tend to the flock, as it were, much more? Because it's not just cerebral. Because when you sit with somebody that has questions, it's not just like, point and counterpoint and this, so it's not like a Wikipedia about it. No, they have something internal, there's a psychology behind it. They used to do this on Al-Azhar, but they don't really do that a lot now. I mean, almost non-existent. So this is something, that's again low-hanging fruit. It's actually really good for one.
Absolutely, it's a great recommendation, and it's not just traditionals that are guilty of it. It's the Salafis do the same thing. And I tell people even anecdotally when we talk about our Crossroads program, the first interaction that Tarek had with one of our clients who was really had psychological problems. Tarek's like, this is not a religious issue. This guy needs mental help. He's like, I can't get through to this kid. And we're just kind of like, what's going on? Why? He's like, you don't understand. He's not there. This is not point and counterpoint. So it's a very important issue, but that's not the imam's role. And I think you're absolutely right. For Sufism, it was this kind of like the Karate Kid, the wax on, wax off. How do you learn kindness, compassion? How do you learn to control your temper and your anger? And all of those, arts, I think, have been lost in the modern age. There's some Sufi teachers that still do it, but it hasn't been institutionalized in the modern era in religious, Muslim religious institutions, Salafi or not, Salafi or non-Salafi. So I think that would be a great asset. Pastoral care programs would be a great asset. We will add that to the list of recommendations. Anybody else?
Hi, yes. I have a quick comment and then a question. My comment is kind of going back to the line of discussion about the speakers programs. I just wanted to kind of draw a distinction between speakers programs and exchange programs. I think that they are qualitatively different, and you can look at the alumni roles of the IDLP program and professional exchanges and other exchange programs and see that there's a long list of senior government leadership and professionals who are pro-US and have had an opportunity to understand kind of what our culture is about, pluralism and the like. And yet, as we know, the latest budget proposal seeks to slash those almost to zero. So that's my comment. My question is actually about counter-messaging. And I know that all of you mentioned it, and I know, Ambassador, you were at the forefront of those efforts at the State Department, and there's been a lot of proliferation, I guess you could say, of counter-messaging centers in Saudi and elsewhere. My question is, it seems that it's very difficult, at least in my mind, to quantify the efficacy of those efforts. And I'm wondering whether it's anecdotally or data-driven, does anyone have a sense, are we able to measure how effective that counter-messaging is?
Is that for me?
Any of you?
Well, it's an old story. Some of us in this room have lived this in flesh. How do you measure a negative? How do you measure a person that, listen, they say, hey, I saw your video, I loved it. I decided not to become a terrorist. You're not going to get that. So it's very difficult to kind of measure what goes on in the brain, what goes on in the mind, in the psyche. When you're talking about very complex decisions. Think of you or anyone else that you know. Why do people believe this thing as opposed to that thing? Why do you go to church or not go to church? Or go to mosque or not go to mosque? Or a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, right? The choices we make in our lives. Sometimes they're because of a thing that happened to us, but sometimes they're not. So there's an inherent problem in measuring the kind of psychological or intellectual processes which you can't just deconstruct very easily. In my experience in government, thank goodness NBN is not government. Unfortunately, what happens is government is really good at coming up with measuring devices, that are total BS. I mean, is anyone here from the military? No. There are institutions of the U.S. government that are really good in generating metrics that measure something. Those metrics may or may not have a connection to the real world. I'll just leave it at that.
One of the advantages we have now, though, is we have analytical tools that we have sentiment analysis tools that can measure how certain tweets, posts, videos are being viewed, shared, retweeted, quoted online. So we do have now, thankfully, the ability to do that. So when you hear jihadists say, that the state is not Islamic, that's being repeated. Since the 1950s, that's been repeated. Where is the counterpoint to which they have to now respond to? It doesn't exist. They're saying the same concept that say almost verbatim now, almost 50, 60 years later. So the problem is we haven't begun to engage at that level where if we start to engage, they're going to be forced to respond to what we're saying if what we're saying becomes popular enough. And then you can measure it. Now they're going to come up with another way of phrasing the same concept. But we don't have that. And in Egypt, we don't have that, for example. Either you're in love with al-Sisi, and you're singing Sisi songs and Sisi and all of these type of things, or you're Ikhwan and you're cursing. There's no middle ground. This is not going to be retweeted. This is not going to be retweeted. We have to have something that's more substantial in the middle that we can start to agitate the conversation. If we agitate, then we can measure through these algorithms and I've used these sentiment analysis tools before in previous work privately. I've used it, I've seen them, and I have measured. I have measured and it works. It works miraculously. Within a week, you can start measuring all of these things. So there are tools to do that, and a lot of these things are off-the-shelf solutions. So we don't need fancy metrics made by the Pentagon. We can just plug and play.
Three questions.
Oh.
Boom, right down the line. Maureen, in your comments somewhere along the way, you said we have not done well empowering the right groups. Who is we, and who are the right groups? For Tarek, I'm confused, and I'm hopeful that there's an answer to this. When the original policy came out of the White House here domestically, October 2011, with no money, no funding, and no one in charge, no staffing, one of the early on thoughts, and it's been a thought forever, was, well, in that event, if it's going to be small and limited and with minimal funding, can't we find out, and this is going to tie into your question, Ambassador, who around the world of our partners, between Intel and state and DOD and law enforcement in their normal course of business, who is doing what? Who is meeting with success? And then bring that back here and make a determination here domestically, is that practical, is it legal, is it affordable, and it is the right thing to do? So when you talk about the repository at Al-Azhar, I'm wondering, well, and you made it sound like there's a problem, maybe I mistook the comment, getting that information out or leveraging it or learning from it. Whose job is that, and does it have to be done diplomatically, or are there other ways of going at it if for some reason diplomatically it's too hard? Because it seems to me like there's some there. And then finally for the ambassador, along those lines, in your travels around these different countries and talking to different services and academics, what, if anything, have you seen someone do that we ought to be doing here that we're not doing? Thank you very much. Hetty, I'll think of something for you. Just give me a second.
I'm okay.
Okay, I guess I'll start with the first question. I mean, I think that it's not an exclusively Egyptian challenge with empowering the right groups. I think when I say we here, I mean both the U.S. government, civil society, the international community, those folks who want to, from abroad, go into Egypt and do certain activities. We have an over-reliance on working with the same usual suspects. They're English-speaking urban elite, and when it even comes down to religious leader engagement, we're going with the loudest talking heads. And we're not really doing our due diligence with reviewing, what are their stances towards religious minorities? What are their stances towards violent protests? And instead, we tend to kind of use a very positivist approach. We're just kind of putting people into boxes, you know, are these the good guys, the bad guys, what's their institutional affiliation? But even when we talk about these broad recommendations of empowering institutions like Al-Azhar, you know, we don't really mean that literally. You know, you have to work with religious actors within these institutions because they are so large. So you have to come up with certain you know, values that we're trying to promote and espouse. So work with the type of local actors that are actively promoting tolerance, social cohesion, that have taken a very pluralistic, you know, approach to fostering social harmony. But often, unfortunately, that we're not doing that kind of due diligence, and we're willing to reach out with those folks that are most willing to reach us, and sometimes they have ulterior motives.
I'm so glad you asked this question because your level of confusion is my level of confusion because I'm asking the same question. Why have we not gone to reach out to these people? So when we ask the embassy folk, they say, well, they didn't return our phone call. Really? That's why? Oh, they don't have anybody that speaks English. Yeah, but you're the embassy, for God's sake. You're supposed to have, don't you have a host of Copts downstairs that are English, Arabic speakers? Go engage them. They're lame excuses. And then, when the weekend comes, and you go to Lucille's on Road 9, and you go to Charwood's and Gemat Dor Arabe, you see all of the embassy folk were all there. All the expats are hanging out in the same places. So they're not, the radar's not out there. They're not gathering the information. Why has the U.S. Embassy in Cairo not reached out to Sheikh Idris al-Idrisi? He hosts festivals in stadiums in the southern. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptians flock to his functions. That's free advertisement. They're all disciples of him, so they're going to listen to anything that he has to say. He's being used now by the government to reconcile between the Arab tribe, the Bedouin tribes rather, in Sinai and in the western part of the country. Why hasn't the government gone out, or the embassy gone out to engage with these people? I don't know the answer to that question. Either they don't know, which is very disturbing, that our assets on the ground that are getting paid by our tax dollars don't know these things, or there's some other consideration that they don't want to say. Like the lady that met with me at the embassy that didn't want to give me her card or tell me what her name was. Maybe there's just something that they just don't want me to know about. But I have the same question. I do not know the answer to that question.
So, to you and the ambassador, does that need to be done through the embassy, or can that be done Stanford, Al-Azhar, or Harvard, or George Washington, or Georgetown? Does it have to be the official U.S. government channels to get an academic exchange on a collection of information relative to the top?
Well, that just comes down to money. It's the question of who's going to pay for it. There are many examples of you know, higher education to higher education institutions, you know, partnerships, often funded by governments. That's not a surprising thing. That happens all the time. I think what's lacking, and Dr. Tariq is talking about, you know, the experience of the embassy. A lot of it is the personal dimension. You have to feel comfortable with the space. You have to know how to engage. If you can't speak Arabic and you're doing your one tour in the Arab world in Egypt, you're never gonna, you know, you're going from Canada to Cairo, and then you're going to, I don't know, you know, Stockholm after that. You know, you're clueless. And that's a problem. We have hardworking, good people in the foreign service, but a lot of this requires a kind of personal commitment and understanding, which is often lacking. By the way, when you talk about the challenges in this space, the space of Islamism and jihadism, I think one of the problems is we see it, we don't recognize it for what it is. I mentioned it. This is a revolutionary ideology. You're dealing with minorities. These are small groups of people. This is not the masses, although they influence masses and they draw strength from the masses. But these are committed revolutionary vanguards, and we need to think about them in the terms of ideological warfare that kind of we had it during the Cold War. Maybe the Cold War we didn't do it that well either, you know? And there was stuff that was done in the Cold War which basically was the CIA going and giving somebody a bag of money to do something.
We still do that, no?
I don't know.
Maybe not the right
You know what I mean? There are things that need to be done that should not be publicized, and things that need to be done. The intelligence community or others need to do it, or it needs to be done in partnerships. I can't say whether that's being done or not. If it's not, it should be.
And I would just like to say that we are sometimes, I mean, are downright hostile, don't want to do it. So it's not just ignorance or lack of resources. I mean, that I believe that a number of policymakers in the U.S. government and the State Department don't believe our perspectives on this. They believe, I think, Ambassador, did you say that Islamism is the panacea to jihadism? That, you know, like use this as, it's the kryptonite. The kryptonite. It's just, this is the solution, you know? And you see it even happening now with basically the exiling of Qatar and the Qatar administration. It's like the Saudis are like, the problem is the brotherhood. Let's dump this all on Qatar and we'll all be okay. And open a $500 million center in Saudi on ideology and done and dusted. So, I mean, you know, we just have to be willing to be a lot more critical in how we're going to solve these problems, I think. Well, thank you everyone. I want to stop on time. Thank you all for your time and for coming and for participating. And please, let's thank our panelists and Ambassador.